Hello, welcome to today's webinar titled Lighting the Way to Climate Resilience, Transforming the Energy Industry. Today's webinar is sponsored by Copperleaf, and I'm Teresa Hansen. I'm the Vice President of Content here at T&D World. Now I'd like to introduce you to today's moderator. Bo Poats is a Managing Director for Black & Veatch. He works in the BV Management Consulting Organization, supporting business technology applications and asset performance management. He brings 39 years of advisory leadership experience in energy asset and enterprise risk management, financial structuring and valuation, and organizational strategy. Welcome, Bo. It's great to have you here. I'm going to turn the program over to you and let you introduce a panelist and get the discussion started.
Okay, thank you very much, Teresa. I am Bo Poats, serving as your moderator, and pleased to briefly introduce our expert panelists. We have a very interesting a mix and great experience base across our panel. I will ask them to each elaborate a little bit more on their role within their organizations. But let me first just provide introductions to first Carmen Benoit. Carmen is a manager in asset management strategy and planning for Enbridge and a seasoned application user with respect to resiliency issues. Our second panelist is Brian Pierre. Dr. Pierre is with Sandia National Labs, where he's the principal member of the technical staff and acting manager of the Electric Power Systems Research Department at Sandia. Third panelist is Ahmed Mousa. Dr. Mousa is manager of Utility of the Future and Electric and Gas Asset Strategy at Public Service Electric and Gas in New Jersey. And our fourth panelist is Mr. Damien Quentin. Damien heads and is a principal consultant and leads the pipeline practice at Copperleaf, and is also very active in leading their ESG impact analysis services. With that, I'll suggest that we go into our discussion. We've structured the panel discussion around three guiding questions. First question set or group is with respect to redefining value related to climate and grid resiliency issues. Second guiding set of questions are structured around delivering on the strategy and associated results associated with resiliency analysis. And then finally, a session on demonstrating results and communicating progress therefrom in terms of key stakeholders, both internal and external. So we'll move along that sequence and hopefully leave 5 or 10 minutes at the end to address as many of the questions we can get to. With that, I'm going to go ahead and kick us off with a starting question. And this is in the redefining value area, and I'll ask Ahmed to provide the initial panelist response. And again, panelists, please take the opportunity to elaborate on your role within your companies. But Ahmed, if you would start us off in describing the types of climate-related risks that you're seeing in your organization and others faced by the industry today.
Thank you, both for the question, and thanks, Copperleaf, for the invite. So I would say we had like 3 professors, if you will, for the utility so far. In 2003, the blackout was kind of an introduction to the importance of a reliable transmission grid. The 2012 Superstorm Sandy really redefined what resiliency is. And since then, basically, we've been focusing on making the system more robust to Mother Nature attacks. And then lately, I would say that maybe COVID and post-COVID, that kind of put the highlight on the ESG perspective. So, I mean, I manage the Utility of the Future. I work in electric, gas, and nuclear. So, in a very high level, I would say we're trying our best, at least on the East Coast, to kind of see, after you make the grid reliable, resilient, and of course, cyber resilient as well, it's now time to kind of focus from all angles on climate change. So every decision we make, every thought, every strategy must be evaluated through this ESG, view. The good news is, all the utilities and others are working very closely together. to come up with the best here, because at the end of the day, we all share the same planet and same climate. So right now, again, the focus is on continuing to enhance the resiliency of the grid. So that's something ongoing since post-storm Sandy, and that's going to be ongoing. And we're trying to make, I would say, the climate change mitigation goals as well. So that's the latest that we got from 2012, and we're basically building on this as we go forward. We're looking forward to COP27, what's going to come out of it, and more discussion as we go. Thanks, Mo.
Thanks very much, Ahmed. Brian, if you would describe what Sandia Labs is saying with respect to climate drivers that you're addressing on behalf of your client organizations.
Yeah, thanks, Bo. As mentioned, so I'm Brian Pierre in the Electric Power Systems Research Department at Sandia National Labs. Sandia is a Department of Energy lab with about 14,000 employees, and our department and a group of other departments look pretty closely at climate resilience. Specifically, Ahmed gave a great introduction to some of the large-scale events that have happened in the past. Sandia also has looked at many of these sort of events. For example, Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico was a large-scale event that was devastating for Puerto Rico. So a lot of the work that Sandia focused on over the past 8 years or so has been related to hurricanes. So hurricane resilience, trying to improve and optimize our investment decisions to improve resilience to hurricanes. Other events we've also looked at, for example, the Texas 2021 winter storm event. That was a large-scale blackout across Texas and other states in February of 2021. So trying to identify which generators need the greatest investments to improve their resilience to winter storm events so that they don't need to go offline in the future when these events occur. And then we work with other parts of the country as well. So in the Midwest, we've looked at other winter storm-related events. We have multiple projects that are looking at wildfires. Many of those are focused in California. So working with many different partners to build up our resilience to these climate risks and these natural disasters.
Thank you, Brian. It sounds like quite a full spectrum that Sandia is addressing. Carmen, if you could introduce yourself and provide some perspective on Enbridge's approach and view of climate risk drivers.
Great, thanks, Bo. Thanks for having us here today. So my name is Carmen Benoit. I work for Enbridge. It's about 20 years here now at Enbridge. I'm working on an asset management transformation that spans our enterprise. And one of our focus areas is how we invest over time to build resilience in our assets. And we've been working really closely with Copperleaf. We'll hear from Damien here shortly on how we've worked together and, again, how we've redefined value at Enbridge. So Enbridge is one of the largest energy infrastructure companies in the world. We operate the world's longest and most complex crude oil and liquids pipelines system and move about 30% of the crude produced across North America every day. So it's about 3 million barrels of crude oil and liquids every day that's transported within North America. We also have a natural gas transmission midstream business, and this network is truly unrivaled in the industry due to its scale, its scope, its connectivity, and we move about 20% of all the gas consumed in the U.S. We also have North America's largest natural gas utility company by volume and the third largest by customer counts. We serve about 3.9 million customers every day, and that system, that part of our business has been delivering energy for 170 years, which is seems wild when we think about the ages and stages of all of those systems. And then since we invested in our first wind farm in 2002, we've committed more than $8 billion in capital to renewable energy and power transmission projects. So there's a great deal of scale to our organization, and we do face climate risks in each parts of those business. So Ahmed talked about blackouts. We've seen a great deal of impacts to our Gulf assets due to hurricanes. And on our pipeline side, a big risk to our business is flooding that could result in some slope destabilization and leak risk to our business. Not to mention something that's a little bit closer to home here. Our flooding in the city of Calgary back in 2013 was a bit of practice for working from home, building some resiliency in our infrastructure, our technology assets as well. So great deal of scale, lots of risk to manage within Enbridge across our enterprise.
Thanks very much, Carmen. And let's give Damien some time to introduce himself. And Damien, your perspective on what organizations are addressing and prioritizing with respect to climate resiliency.
Thanks, Bo, and thanks everybody else for attending. So as you said, when you introduced me, I'm the ESG and pipelines practice lead in the Americas at Copperleaf, and I've been with Copperleaf for about 6 years now. Just a bit about Copperleaf. So Copperleaf is a decision analytics solution, which means we help companies that manage critical infrastructure make decisions on how and when they invest in that infrastructure. And so in my role at Copperleaf, I help our clients align their investment planning and decision-making to ESG strategy. And effectively what that means is we basically transform their decision-making process into a value-based decision-making methodology where we need to have an understanding of investment value, often in terms of the risk mitigated through those investments. So what this means is that for each dollar that I spend, I've got a quantification, right, in terms of dollars of the value brought to the organization. So when I think about these climate risks, of which there are many, right, that pose threats to utilities, we think about resilience, right, being able to protect my infrastructure from adverse weather events. I want to have an investment planning methodology that considers, for each dollar that I spend on resilience, I need to know what the value is in terms of the risk mitigated, and that helps me understand, well, where do I need to be spending my money, in what order, with what kind of urgency, given that there's no way I could possibly afford to do everything that I need to do as quickly as I might want to.
Okay. Thank you, Damien. And you've kind of teed up the notion of relative value and assessing resiliency value. Just first contextually, with the trade-offs that utilities and others are facing with respect to meeting net zero carbon objectives, that set against the requirement to address resiliency, of course, maintain and improve reliability and manage customer costs. My question, and Damien, I'll start with you if that's all right, is how best in the shifting landscape and set of competing priorities are utilities deciding when and where to spend, and how are environmental and community impact considerations being addressed in the decision-making process?
Right. Yeah, it's a great question. We're always going to have to make trade-offs between competing priorities. And as I was sort of hinting to in my last answer, the most defensible way to do that is to make those decisions based on value. So when I look at the value of my investments, the obvious ones are looking at the hard financial ROI, right? If I spend money in this way, I get this much money back. But I also need to be able to quantify value in terms of avoided reliability consequences, in terms of safety events, in the same way that I would do so in terms of environmental or community impact. So, for example, when I'm making comparisons across my portfolio to decide how I'm going to make my trade-offs, I need to understand what's the value of emissions reductions, right? How much does that benefit my organization? I need to understand what the remediation impacts are, right? If there's a risk of this asset failure and there's a remediation involved in that, what's that impact to my organization? I need to understand environmental justice as another example. When I think about ESG as a whole, and I talk about different socioeconomic groups experiencing environmental impacts to my infrastructure in disparate ways. And so being able to understand the value in those terms, quantify value in terms of community environmental impact allows me to make trade-offs with my very real competing priorities to provide safe, reliable, and affordable service so that I can understand what's urgent, what's important, and what's the best sort of investment strategy in achieving all those objectives.
Okay, thank you very much, Damien. Brian, let's turn to you next on that question. What's Sandia's perspective on these competing priorities?
Yeah, so at this time, utilities and other organizations, they're all trying to become more resilient. They're also trying to reach net zero goals or decarbonization goals. And then also they're looking at equity metrics as well, trying to improve equity, and then more traditional objectives like reliability and affordability as well. So you have all these different competing objectives, and you need a decision process to go through. So Sandia has been very focused on developing these decision processes where you can have a framework to go through and identify the best investment packages or investment decisions that meet your utility's needs. So when we're looking at identifying those optimal investment packages, you can go through this optimization models or other decision frameworks and then indicate the trade-offs or Pareto frontiers between different emerging objectives. So this methodology, we're primarily focused on identifying those trade-offs and also identifying the stakeholders that need to be involved in this decision making. So you'll have stakeholders from the community level up to the regional level, and hopefully you have certain goals that align at all these different across all these different stakeholders. And so you need to have within this decision making process a way to hear the input from all these different stakeholders as well.
Thanks very much, Brian. And I've just noted a question I'll dial back to on equity and community impact. But let's turn to Carmen now. Carmen, what's Enbridge's perspective on these competing impacts?
Thanks, Bo. As Brian said, we're trying to manage multiple priorities and create forums to facilitate trade-offs, yet still optimize investments over time to achieve both our enterprise and our business unit objectives. So, and Damien also alluded to, it's not about if we'll invest in a strategic objective or an investment that is aligned to a strategic objective, but it's when. When is the best time, which is best facilitated through a centralized process to consider how we might bundle some work, how we might coordinate outages around the work, around our throughput forecast and refinery turnarounds that our customers are experiencing, as well as peak power periods. So creating the environment where folks will come to the table, identify what our assets need is so very important, creating that space to, in a centralized process, to identify. If we don't know about it, we can't plan for or optimize it. So if we think about what's happening at Enbridge to deliver on our strategic priorities, and we've released recently new net zero and ESG goals. We've got innovation needs and automation objectives, GHG emissions savings, asset renewal compliance, and operating risk, day-to-day operating risk. So this requires a centralized decision-making process and a value framework to optimize that when of investment. Clear roles, accountabilities, how do we invest within our constraints, yet still achieve our objectives? So this is how we've improved decision-making, investment decision-making at Enbridge over time. We went from about 3 ways to measure risk to about 30 ways to measure value, to create a value-based decision-making framework. So if you would have asked us last year, how much are we spending to reduce GHG emissions, or how much are we spending to build climate resiliency? We couldn't answer that, but now we can with the tools we have in place, with a centralized process, by identifying the right stakeholders to identify those asset needs.
Thanks, Carmen. So kind of in summary there, and I'll turn to Ahmed next, but it sounds like you've really got your house in order in terms of identifying, what the sources are of the costs and benefits, and generally think of those as utility, customer, and society, or maybe broadly other stakeholders. And then you've also got a consistent and central way of comparing cost benefits, therefore competing impacts within and across the organization with all three considered. Is that a fair summary?
It's a well-said summary. Thanks, Bo. Yeah.
Okay. Just wanted to confirm. Anyway, Ahmed, can you give us PSE&G's perspective on how you're dealing with competing resource issues, risks?
Yeah, sure. So I think to add to all the great points that were discussed, as I mentioned prior, I mean, right now this is the focus, right, for now to the future. New Jersey has a plan to go 100% clean by 2050. PSE&G has a plan to go net zero by 2030, which I always tell people that's like 7 years from now. That's a couple of Super Bowls, 2 World Cup, and that's we're there. So we don't have the luxury of the time to plan. It's time to reinforce. And right now we're working with all the key groups to kind of reevaluate everything we do, right? If you look at your daily life, I mean, COVID had a change, right? And then we adapt. And now, depending on your work schedule, you have a completely different perspective how you work, your relationship with the family, and so forth. So what we're doing right now is we're looking at the planning. My job as utility of the future, working with the state. We have a very interesting energy master plan that I advise people to look at. We have governor goals. So we were trying to really address how we can meet all this stuff in a reliable, resilient, and environmentally friendly way. So that goes to the daily perspective. Once you talk about the climate, you no longer focus on the peak day, which is a typical planning thing. You focus on every hour, every minute. We've been very active in the renewable business, right? Making up great requirements to make it very easy for renewables to interconnect. We go in, again, for emissions perspective, how we as employees deal with emissions, how our vendors, and so forth. So I think, like which was mentioned before, one of the best things we did is we get all the brain powers together. Ongoing we have a lot of senior and young crowd that are kind of focused on everything, right? Greening the entire utility system from a construction perspective to how we handle emergency events and so forth. So I also encourage people to look at our sustainability report that we released recently and the one from last year, and you kind of see how utilities are doing. We're very active in a lot of best practice and benchmarking, working with a lot of other utilities because, we all need power. That's a given, especially after COVID. So how can we maintain that reliable power we have right now? And then from a reliability perspective, it's always very easy to measure. We have safety. We have a lot of metrics that made it very easy for us to see if the utilities are doing a good job or a bad job. Resiliency, in a way, it's a little bit complex, but I mean, flood was mentioned before, so I think in the latest Hurricane Ida, utilities did a great job. So that's kind of a sign that the system is getting better. Now, from a climate change perspective, we're looking at all the emission control, emission monitoring. So we kind of go into every possible bad actor, if you will, to see how can we enhance the system for now and for the next decades to come. So that's really how we're doing it. And again, we'd be happy to discuss in more details later.
Yeah. Thanks, Ahmed. And I can attest to your full portfolio approach. I know PSE&G is one of the first to do a renewable hosting capacity analysis, down into the distribution system in particular, and then also, of course, you all are behind the PSE&G Energy Strong 2 submission to your Board of Public Utilities, which of course is focused on resilience. So you've been managing to address simultaneously these competing issues in formal programs and submissions. Ahmed, if you would stay on, I think I want to pivot to sort of part 2 of our question set, which is focused on delivering results. So my question to you and the other panelists is, what tangible results are your utility or other utilities seeing from climate resilience work to date, if any?
Sure. First, thanks for the compliment. And I think to answer your question, our Energy Strong 1 and 2, that was, I would say, the best indicator. Again, just look at the latest IDA. So I live in Queens, New York. Both utilities in New York and New Jersey did an amazing job. Actually, there were more cars damaged during Hurricane Ida than people losing power. So that's the sign, right? We look at the flood level. Of course, Mother Nature is never on our side. We just look at the performance. So that's kind of from a flood level. We look at how innovative our relays and all the other gadgets we installed to help us mitigate events like this and restoring the customer quicker. We are implementing distribution management system, advanced distribution management systems. So we are in the business of adding this intelligence, both from a physical, which is physical resiliency, and the software perspective, right? So we've been doing good from that perspective. Now, the beauty of the future ESG and working with COP 26, 27, and so forth is, it's no longer about having a nice plan. It all must be scientific-based matrix. So that's what we're really looking for. And right now we are actually doing that, right? We have a lot of programs that have been approved, part of our Clean Energy Future filing, and we focus heavily on the equity piece of it. So we are seeing results. We are helping with electrification. We're helping with the renewables. And as I mentioned before, we are working on this whole emission sector. Our fleet, as owned by the utilities, is basically solar storage and nuclear energy only. We got rid of all our fossil fuel generation. So again, there's a lot of, for example, on COP26, one thing they agreed upon was the methane leak kind of detection and elimination. That's something we're working on with the industry leaders to find the best ways of kind of getting rid of this leaks. A couple of weeks from now, just start COP27, we'll see what's going to happen. But on a very high level, just to answer your question, that's exactly what we're doing now. We are working on analyzing the entire business, identifying what are I would say, the sources of emissions, and then performing, I would say, complex calculations to make sure that, next year, like if we have the discussion next year, we're able to completely quantify how we made New Jersey a better place and the surrounding area. So more to come on that one. And again, we're looking at everything, scope 1, 2, and 3, basically directly and indirectly, working with vendors and so forth. I think it's easier to treat this as how utilities treated cybersecurity and how they look at other vendors, how vulnerable they are. So we're kind of doing the same thing for the climate. It's not sufficient that the utility is doing a great job when our vendor is kind of destroying the environment. So that's really what we're looking for, how we live, how we work, how we get to work, our work itself, and even how we get the stuff from others.
Mm-hmm. Thanks very much, Ahmed. And 1, 2, and 3, of course, being primary, secondary, and tertiary with respect to that sequence. So very important in terms of the full supply chain. Carmen, can you briefly address how Enbridge is assessing and evaluating tangible results? And we do have a very good question I want to make sure we get to at the end, which is somewhat foundational. So in your answer, if you can address, how resiliency results are being defined and calculated, if at all.
Thanks, Bo. So tangible results for us are really optimizing our plans to reduce our scope 1 and 2 emissions and working together with our partners to generate some self-power opportunities. Again, I like to think about the complete asset management framework. Asset investment planning, of course, is a big part of this, but it's really about an ecosystem that we create around asset management internally and with our external partners to consider how we bring the right people together at the right time to optimize that when of investing. And we also see lower overall life cycle costs. So when we have folks really trying to drive down costs within our constraints and understanding our long-term asset needs, as well as our commercial objectives, we find folks are really coming up with some innovative solutions to manage those risks, but also the upside of the risk equation on opportunities, and how do we produce more competitive options to reduce those emissions over time. So it's really about aligning our enterprise, our business unit, our commercial objectives, what our customers, shippers, what our stakeholders, our investors need to what our assets need. From a people perspective, just so much less churn at Enbridge, less time gathering data, more time analyzing based on the sum of all threats. So again, when we're trying to define and measure resilience, it comes back to understanding how we define value. how we put all of our investment needs on a common economic scale so we can understand what the baseline is and what we get out of those dollars once we spend them. And then as a follow-up, really understanding, did we get what we said we would get out of that investment? So in the spirit of continual improvement, again, through a centralized process, a governed process, how do we get better? How do we get better each year in terms of the programs that we're putting together for our assets? So clarifying roles and accountabilities, better collaboration internally, really thinking about this ecosystem of folks that needs to be at the table to optimize decision making. Operations, supply chain, commercial folks, our asset integrity stakeholders. It takes a village, as we say, or we call it an ecosystem at Enbridge.
Mm-hmm.
Does that answer the question, Bo?
It does, Carmen. Thanks very much. I'm going to turn to Brian. Brian, from Sandia's perspective, how do you see resiliency results being analyzed or at least structured for such analysis?
Yeah, so the way Sandia operates is we're one of DOE's national research labs. And often our projects, they start out at a lower TRL level, so a technology readiness level, where we're looking at the theory behind the most novel things to address climate resilience. So typically a project will start at that stage and then evolve into demonstrations where we are trying to work with many different partners. So Sandia is working with DOE, other national labs, universities, utilities, and many different companies as well, all with a same goal of improving climate resilience. And so we start with our novel ideas, and then those lead to demonstration projects, such as working with Puerto Rico on rebuilding their system to become more resilient, but also reach their net zero goals or decarbonization goals. And then evolving from there to open source tools. So once we've demonstrated that our research works in certain situations, then we start releasing these tools so that others can use them and start to build upon them as well. So examples of this, about 8 years ago, we were looking at co-optimizing reliability and resilience. And so that work then evolved into some resilience optimization projects as well, where we look at resilience from 3 different stages. The first stage being a long-term planning, so you're trying to plan for a resilient system while also meeting your other goals as well. The second stage being preemptive action decisions. So let's say you're given a warning that a storm is brewing or that your system may incur an event, a large-scale disaster in the near future, maybe 24 hours in advance. How can you help brace your system, redispatch your resources, reconfigure, and pre-position your systems for that event if it does occur? And then the last stage we look at is restoration decisions. So after the event has happened, how do you go about restoring that system in the most optimal way over a multi-time period restoration process to restore service to critical loads? And throughout this, we're also trying to make our system more resilient to cascading failures as well. So these large-scale events that have occurred in the past, such as mentioned before, the 2003 blackout in the Northeast or the 1996 blackout across the West Coast, these often occurred because of cascading events. So trying to become more resilient to those large-scale cascades as well. So once we have this research developed, then we start applying it in demonstration projects. So Sandia has done a lot of demonstrations with different companies. We've worked with AEP to become resilient to winter storms in the Midwest. We've worked with Texas to become resilient to winter storms and to hurricanes. So looking at pre-positioning resources in advance of a hurricane to help increase the resilience of substations to flooding. So trying to identify which substations you should be pre-positioning resources to help prevent flooding. Other demonstrations include work with Alaska frequently on microgrid projects. So many of the smaller villages in Alaska, trying to work with them to not only become resilient, but stop being so reliant on diesel generation and therefore work more towards this decarbonization goals as well. And with that, I think I'll stop there.
Anyway, that's great, Brian. I think you touched on some of the metrics around resilience, the three component parts, and very important, and obviously the three target audience impacts. But it sounds like a lot of good pilots in progress, and we'll look forward to hopefully some of those results being published downstream. I want to pivot now to demonstrating progress, particularly to various stakeholder groups. So the context of this is that we're saying that organizations need to demonstrate, response to climate exposure, address community impacts, both to their customers, but also to all of the customers, regulators, investors, and other stakeholders, including, by the way, their employee base. So my question, and Ahmed, I'll go back to you first and just limit this to two panelists, but how are utilities communicating climate resistance progress to your regulators, customers, investors, and other stakeholders? And in particular, what types of data or projections are those stakeholder groups looking for to review? So a fairly specific stakeholder progress reporting and review question to you first, Ahmed.
Yeah, sure. So great question, and that's as you know, initially utilities were not that big on data sharing because we always try to protect the confidentiality of the customer. But from your perspective, that's exactly what we're doing, right? We're very actively on a lot of the best practices benchmarking work with utilities in the U.S. and outside the U.S. Again, because there's not a magical answer that it's not like a one size fits all. We have issues here in the East Coast that Texas and California they don't have, and vice versa. So what we're really doing is, I think this is very critical. What we're doing for the remainder of 2022 is identifying, again, the sources of emissions, where we need to do more work. We're very actively engaging a lot of universities, so we are working with the educational sector. We love, of course, to continue working with the Department of Energy and all the labs. That would be great as well. And through the work, through the the international level and cooperation with the COP 26 and 27. But in general, New Jersey, and many of you guys are familiar, they always follow a very structured stakeholder process. So any, from building a substation to just work on the energy master plan, we have a very complex, very long stakeholder process to get feedback from everybody, basically. So that's going to continue ongoing. I would say that the first step is that our climate change and sustainability report. That kind of gives you an idea of what we did in the past, what we're working on in the near future. Our clean energy future filing, I would say, is the best answer for you from all the energy efficiency measures, demand response, and so forth, and energy storage. There's a lot of things we're working on. There's a lot of stuff in the energy master plan. But just very quickly, really, we are working on enhancing the communication between us internally first, certainly other utilities. We work with a lot of consultants and a lot of industry leaders, and I mentioned Poats. So I think we are addressing right now or at least looking for the gaps that we have. We're also very active on the enterprise risk management perspective. So once we have all the gaps identified, we're going to bring in all this, consultants, startups, and all this brain power to the table to see basically what we could do that is, best from a climate change to basically, to your point, to demonstrate progress. We have been doing that from our Energy Strong 1, 2, the GSMP for the gas system 1 and 2. We hope to continue doing this for our clean energy future filing. So we have some track record. Right now, we're just enhancing our programs from a climate change perspective. And that also goes for the Energy Strong, our operation, the way we operate the system, our operators at the control center. Right now, you have to really look from a perspective of climate change. And I'll end with this. So right now, if you look at your Google Maps, usually you get, avoiding tolls, avoiding highways, and so forth. Now there's an option that shows you the best green option, right? The least impact on the environment. That's really, in a way, what we're doing is every action, every investment, how are we making the grid, of course, the customers, and the climate better.
Thank you, Ahmed. Very, very insightful, and Mother Nature's giving you plenty of opportunities to benchmark against, unfortunately. But Carmen, from Enbridge's perspective, how are you presenting progress and supporting that with metrics to your key stakeholder groups?
Thanks, Bo. I think I've got a pretty quick answer for this. Enbridge, in late 2020, we released new ESG targets to our investment community, our shareholders, our community partners, actually really aggressive ESG goals. So achieving net zero GHG emissions by 2050, reducing GHG emissions intensity by 35% by 2030. And our partners, our communities, they're holding us accountable to these. So we regularly report progress to target. And in my area in particular, we're tracking our spend, as I mentioned earlier, and the value realized from investments where the objective is primarily to save GHG emissions. So folks are watching us, and we're reporting regularly to show our commitment to those targets.
Very good, and that's a good segue for the next question, staying on demonstrating progress and results. Damien, I'll direct this to you initially, then come back to you, Carmen. But, making an environmental impact and management a part of your everyday decision making is certainly a growing concept of value, but also both externally with respect to ESG and other metrics and internally. We've seen it happen certainly with safety. I live in such a environment, and now decision making across all industries when it comes to ESG and climate resilience. How do utilities ensure that workers and your staff feel connected and part of this overall climate strategy? Damien, I'll start with you on that.
Thanks. Yeah, great question. Culture is potentially, a very challenging thing to change. And if you want to make that change, it needs to be supported at the top levels of the organization, but also ingrained throughout. So everyone needs to be talking about it. So we look as an example to, the safety revolution that happened, and how today we have every meeting, depending on where you are, starting with safety minutes, right? We have signs on the shop floor that, I don't know if we still do, that count the days since the last safety incident, right? The safety culture is just everywhere. And we need to think, okay, well, what needs to happen for us to see the same thing with ESG? And I think that means, talking about it, first of all. So, maybe one day we're going to have ESG minutes or climate minutes at the top of meeting agendas. But in order to get there, I think that first, like I said, it needs to happen at the top levels of the organization. And that means that the enterprise ESG strategy needs to be clear. And it needs to be clear both internally and externally, right? How the company will act on that strategy and what progress needs to be made. So what the organization wants to do, we can talk about targets, we can talk about objectives. That needs to be understood, like I said, everywhere in the organization so that people know this is where we want to get to. And in order to get there, we all need to, achieve X, Y, Z as a part of getting to there. And like I said, with culture, it really requires everyone to be talking about it. I've repeated myself with that, but I think it's really important. Like I said, with safety minutes, maybe ESG minutes is the answer.
Thank you, Damien. Carmen, what is Enbridge's perspective on that ethic and how you're, in particular, embracing your staff and the company culture in that process?
This is probably one of my favorite questions you've asked so far, Bo. And at Enbridge, we say we deliver the energy people need and want. And I talked earlier about the asset management transformation happening or underway here at Enbridge enterprise-wide at the moment. And our mission in embedding asset management principles is to say, our assets are safe, reliable, and profitable. We know it, and we can prove it. Our values are safety, integrity, respect, inclusivity. So I don't know if that speaks to anyone else the way it speaks to me, but to me that means creating inclusiveness through a robust asset management framework and understanding how through centralized processes, what behaviors are we trying to change? How do we want people to feel in terms of creating an investment plan that enables us to truly say our assets are safe, reliable, and profitable. We know it and we can prove it. So we do employ advanced systems to ensure we're making the right decisions at the right time, but ensuring we've got that senior leader sponsorship that Damien talked about and employee buy-in and understanding, especially when it comes to decisions today that impact us for decades to come and future generations. This is crucial to understanding how we optimize and bringing people together. So having that centralized decision-making framework that's easy to communicate, that everyone understands, is the key to success. So it's a really big culture shift from understanding business as usual risks to what are those transformation risks that get in the way of creating the culture we want. So different technologies, different commercial regimes, different priorities, moving to a model that will support investments that we need to make in the short term and how we invest long term to create and deliver the value that we've promised to our stakeholders. So decisions are made differently. Choices are viewed through a completely different lens, and I really think it brings people together within Enbridge.
Thank you, Carmen. Very thorough answer, and as someone who spent nearly 4 decades in enterprise risk management, you hit some consistent themes there, namely, culture, common vocabulary, I would say also, common set of principles and objectives, and ultimately clarity on how we're rowing together to those objectives. So very, very consistent themes, and the broader picture of enterprise risk, of course, which resiliency and climate now are a much larger wedge. So I want to shift. The last question I have, really I'd kind of put this under the category of challenges and needs going forward, and I'll allow each panelist to respond, but with an eye on the clock succinctly. So Brian, let's start with you on this. But looking forward, given that both federal and state government, consumer organizations, and the press for hitting net zero targets, wherever they may be set, and the challenge in both meeting those net zero targets while also addressing the resiliency needs of climate change. How do you see those challenges being addressed, and what can we do to accelerate progress going forward in your view? Brian?
Yeah, thanks, Bo. I'll touch on a couple things. So Carmen has really brought to light the decision process that needs to be really integrated with multiple stakeholders and that are involved to make the best decisions. But then also I want to touch on some that Damien talked about, which is the value of these investment decisions. So some of these investment decisions are hard to quantify the value, right? So when you make a resilience investment, that investment might be very hard to quantify the value of it due to social consequences, economic consequences, things that are more difficult. So developing the correct metrics to capture that value is also very important. So trying to find and advance these metrics so that we have a better understanding of how these investment decisions are impacting society as a whole is very important. So for example, Sandia's developed some metrics on social burden. A social burden metric is what we call it. And basically when a large-scale power outage happens, it's all about how much effort it takes a person to get all the basic needs in life. So things like getting to a grocery store, a hospital, and so then this information and this metric is put into our decision-making process so that we can better invest to identify the needs of all the people in the area that's affected. So, for example, we use that social burden metric in our microgrid design toolkit, which is identifying where to create these microgrids in a certain area when these large-scale disasters happen, so that people have access to what is vital, such as food, water, communications, hospitals, and many other things as well. And I'll stop there.
Okay, thanks, Brian. Ahmed, how does PSE&G look at the challenges associated with net zero commitments versus meeting climate resiliency?
Yeah, I think that the most important thing is how would the weather look like? A lot of the stuff is trying to mitigate Mother Nature attacks. Are we guaranteed that if we really meet all this climate change goals that, it's going to be nice and sunny and no storms? So I would say fear of the unknown. So as we learn more, we enhance our models. We plan to use artificial intelligence, machine learning to kind of do a better forecasting. We have a couple of pilots planned. Also, as the technology progress, some transformers are like 90 plus years old. They're in service. Maybe the solar and storage have a much lower lifespan. So we're going to basically pay close attention to technology. Hopefully, with the latest advance in solar and Department of Energy's targets, we're going to have more efficient solar panels and so forth. So we're looking at the lifespan of our system, the lifespan of the renewables, the lifespan, of all the emissions that we spoke about. We continue to, have our aggressive enterprise risk management. There's a lot of the black swan events that may not have happened in Jersey, but they could happen, right? There's a first time for everything. So the same way we treated, I would say, reliability and resiliency, we plan to treat the climate change. Right now there's a couple of issues, of course. Like supply chain is a major issue, whether it's because of COVID or other reasons or the ongoing disturbance in Europe. So we continue to assess and enhance and get better. And again, like we mentioned before, working with all the others external to the utilities, that would really allow us to get to the destination. We do a lot of work with Europe, trying to understand, where they are ahead of us and educate others when we're ahead of them. So I would say it's all of the above that I mentioned. And of course, fear of the complete unknown. What if something completely unplanned for happens? So that's usually the biggest concern for us. But again, we get hit, we react, we build better, and wait for the next hit.
Thanks very much, Ahmed. Carmen, just quickly from Enbridge's perspective, how are you looking at the challenges and that trade-off between commitments and resiliency performance?
Well, I think this will be really quick. It's really about optimizing our approach within constraints to financing climate resilience needs along with everything else. So shipper and customer commitments, general asset renewal. Parts of our liquids business are 70 years old. I mentioned that our gas distribution business is 170 years old, and new opportunities, preparing for the energy transition. There's one wallet. We have constraints, so optimizing our approach, finding new programs over time is really the challenge we have ahead of us.
Very good, Carmen, and very much like your asset focus and optimization. Damien, with your perspective across multiple clients, what are you seeing in terms of that trade-off and how it's being addressed?
Yeah, I quite like the answers I've heard so far. I think that, one of the greatest challenges is that I've set these ESG targets, in terms of emissions or maybe in terms of electric vehicle enablement, et cetera. And how do I know the best way to get there? How do I know if I'm being aggressive enough or not aggressive? Basically, how do I know that the investment plan that I've got over the next 1, 5, 10 years, et cetera, is going to let me achieve these ambitious goals that I've set out? Not only am I thinking of how aggressively I need to be, or in terms of the timing of the work that needs to be done in terms of ESG targets or resilience, but how do I know that if I continue with the status quo in terms of investment planning, that I'm even going to achieve those targets? Obviously, I can't. That's a rhetorical question. But being able to align that ESG strategy to investment planning and being able to optimize investment plans to meet those build concrete plans to meet those goals is a huge challenge and needs to be sort of the status quo as we think about robust methodologies for ESG strategy.
Thank you, Damien. With that, I'm going to turn. We've got a few minutes left to address questions. I see one very important, kind of I'll call it a foundational question, which will allow, I think, the panelists to quickly get back to sort of summarizing their approach. But the question is, how was resilience measured? Getting right back to the fundamentals, what are the component parts of resilience? How is it measured? And specifically in terms of its impact, for example, on reducing risk exposure or potentially increasing value from investments. So I'll put that out. I guess initially, Damien, I'll follow up with you immediately and just open it up to any other panelists that want to address that key metric. And I will offer my own perspectives on this as well based on what I heard today and just historically.
So second part of the question, specifically talking about reduced risk or increased value from investments. And so when we measure resilience, obviously we talk about, well, how resilient is my infrastructure to weather events. But this question here, we're talking about how do I sort of justify investment in resilience? And, from the most fundamental perspective on risk is, I have a consequence and I have a probability, and the product of the two is a measure of my risk, or it is my risk. And so when I think about individual assets and the risk exposure to my organization in terms of climate risk and resilience, I need to think about, well, what happens if this asset fails? What's the impact to my organization? What's the impact to the general public? What's the impact to my environment? I think about all these measures of value that we talked about previously, right? How we quantify the value of investment. What are these consequences that I would avoid by investing in this asset or this area of my infrastructure? And the harder part is, what's the likelihood that that would happen, or that I would see these consequences if I don't perform these investments? And that can be tricky, right? We talked about challenges around predicting the weather and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And I think one of the challenges that we have today is we have to look back and we have to update our modeling, because we have to rethink that these 1 in 100-year events aren't happening every 100 years anymore.
Exactly. And then I'll just allude back to Brian's response, and I work with you a bit, Damien. We think in terms of matrices. He did note that resilience really has three components. There's the avoidance altogether, the mitigation of the impact, and the recovery. So those are three discrete activities that can be measured. And then there's the impact utility, customer, and society / other stakeholders. So I'll just leave it at that in terms of leaving a matrix framework to be addressed. I don't think we have time for any others if we're going to wrap up. I did have some I'd noted, for example, on community impact and measures of equity. Love to follow up on that, the discussion at some point. But with that, I would just like to thank the panelists. I thank T&D World and Copperleaf for hosting this event. And I'm going to turn it back over now to Teresa to wrap up.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much. And I would just like to echo what Bo said. Thanks to all of our panelists. Thanks to Copperleaf for sponsoring this. And of course, Bo, thank you for moderating. We did have some great audience questions. I appreciate the audience being so involved and engaged. So with that, I will tell you all good day, and I hope you have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.